Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today I will be going over this 3D printed bass guitar called the Phi-Bass. Not just forward, I'm not affiliated with Filatone or Colts 3D in any way, shape, or form. So this video is completely unbiased and in my own words and opinions. The model was not free, but was reasonable at around $12 to $15. Total of the hardware, not including filament, was around $80, so not too bad either. For a quick too long didn't watch, this 3D printed bass guitar is unique in that it uses aluminum extrusion for the main structural support instead of bolted and glued on parts of a traditional guitar. Would I recommend this guitar? Not really. There's some glaring issues with the design of this instrument that make me feel like the musicians who are particular about their instruments would absolutely hate this thing. This guitar is also deceptively complex to make and will test your 3D printing capabilities, as well as what luthier skills you may or may not possess. On the other hand, if you are looking for a fun project that produces a fairly capable, albeit sonically and modestly playable bass guitar, this might actually be one worth considering. Now, this video will be divided into three portions. The first part outlining the model, 3D printing aspects, and assembly. The second part of the video will be my overview of the instrument itself and my opinions on it compared to other bass guitars. The third portion will have some raw audio recordings of the bass guitar directly from my audio interface. Starting off with the design. I really think it looks great, and I love the ingenious use of the aluminum extrusion. It really adds the rigidity that an instrument like this needs, and it does inspire confidence that this instrument won't just fold in on itself from string tension. And they model around it fairly well. When you purchase the model, it comes with instructions as well as bill of materials. The instructions are detailed with pictures and diagrams, but they do have one big caveat that I will get into in a minute. But the instructions are good. It even has links to all the required hardware. Although I didn't use the links they provided in the instructions, I was able to find all that I needed on Amazon. Like I said, it was roughly $80 for all the hardware used to build this guitar, but I'm sure a more frugal shopper could put this together for a little less. My biggest gripe about the instructions are when it comes to installing the frets. The instructions are very clear up until you reach the point to install the frets, to which they basically just say, install the frets. And they point to a YouTube video on how to do it. Now, for those unfamiliar with installing frets on a guitar fretboard, installing frets on a guitar is a completely separate project in and of itself, but I'll touch more on that later. Anyway, the model itself is good, and it is apparent that significant thought and effort went into designing this instrument. The parts to this model come accurately scaled and are pre-oriented for optimal printing. However, I did have to make some modifications to some of these parts. For example, the bottom of the body initially came into two separate parts, which I combined into one part using a modeling software, which is Blender. I assume they did this to accommodate smaller printers, but since my print volume was large enough, I felt more comfortable having it be one solid piece rather than two pieces joined together, and so far it's worked out well. I also took the liberty upon myself to remove all of the branding of the initial parts that came designed with it and add my own little personal touch to it. The most important modification I had to make to one of the models was the headstock. I did have to modify the headstock multiple times to fit because my printer and filament were not totally dialed in, but providing your filament and printer are dialed in, the pieces fit well. Which brings me to the 3D printing aspect itself. So I printed all the parts on a Bamboo Lab P1S, and it did produce some pretty fantastic results. Total print time ran roughly 24 hours and used half a kilogram of filament split between Hatchbox Iron Red and Hatchbox Wood Fill. Now, remember when I said the pieces fit well on your printer and filament are dialed in? Well, mine wasn't. So I ended up using roughly 2 kilograms extra filament and tacked on easily an extra 24 hours of printing due to misprints. I won't go too much into detail on all of my failure, but just make sure that your printer and filament are dialed in, or be prepared for some trial and error and or workarounds. As well, almost all of the pieces slot into the aluminum extrusion have an overhang. Here's what one of the pieces look like. As you can see, these parts that get inserted into the grooves of the extrusion all have an overhang that requires support, and there are at least 12 parts that have these kinds of overhangs. So that means that on top of ensuring your printer and filament are properly calibrated, your supports need to be on point as well, or you'll end up bloody trying to remove the supports, you'll break the print trying to slot it into the extrusion, or both. Now, the parts were printed using a standard 0.4mm nozzle with 0.16 millimeter layer height. I used relatively modest print parameters aside from the bottom of the body and the headstock, which I drastically increased wall thickness and infill percentage on those parts to accommodate string tension. Now, onto assembly. The guitar went together well once I had all the parts printed adequately. I did use a polyurethane stain combo on the wood fill printed parts, which I do not recommend, at least this specific brand, Bear, because it dries too fast and I also suck at it. The pickups that are recommended in the instructions are really convenient because it all comes pre-wired, making the pickup installation pretty much drop in. There's no soldering or anything required. The bridge did need some gentle persuasion with a mallet to slot it into the aluminum extrusion. Anyway, assembly took me maybe an hour tops, and the instructions guide you through all of it until you are ready to install the frets. So here's my take on installing frets. This step, at least for me, was the point where I had to ask myself if I had what it took to finish this project, or to just shelve it and give up. Those familiar with guitars and fretting guitars know that the frets on a guitar are one of the most critical parts of the instrument. But it is essential to get right. It really is what separates this project from being just a centerpiece or a functional instrument. It requires extra tools and knowledge. Not only that, but I was completely unable to find any information that specifically describes installing traditional metal frets onto a plastic fretboard. I kind of felt like a space monkey during this whole process. Now, that's not to say there are no parallels installing frets on wood versus plastic, but I couldn't help but feel like there had to be some nuanced differences between the two. As well, I've never installed frets on a wooden guitar neck either, so I had and have no comparison. So, installing the frets on this guitar took more work and planning than the rest of the project combined, hands down. I first tried to use stainless steel frets, but stainless steel frets are a bear to work with. They're super hard to bend, they take forever to file, and the ones I bought were pre-radiused. Now, pre-radiused here is the key word because the fretboard on this bass has no radius at all. It's completely flat. Your typical guitar fretboard will have a curve or radius on the fretboard, but again, this one doesn't. The issue is that the majority of easy-to-find fret wire comes pre-radiused, which typically will require extra shaping to install the frets. I eventually was able to find some non-radius nickel-silver jumbo fret wire, which is typically used in cigar box guitars, and it made the process much easier. The method I used for installing the frets was to use a sacrificial fretboard to cut and shape the frets so I wouldn't scratch up the actual neck. I just printed two of the same fretboard. Well, I broke the first fretboard, but I used the broken fretboard to take my terrible filing skills out on. I then glued the frets into the actual fretboard on the instrument. Overall, it worked okay, but there were some frets that didn't seat all the way and required filing. But the frets did come out rather well, I think. Just know that installing the frets is going to be the step that most likely poses the biggest hurdle between you, the finished product, and a good finished product. Now, for my thoughts and observations on the instrument itself, I'll preface that I've been playing stringed instruments for over 20 years. That being said, music and instruments are subjective, so I present most of this as my opinion, fully knowing many or most will not feel the same way. Now, most of the questions I get pertain to the quality of this instrument, and my reply to that is that it's best to temper your expectations for this or any 3D printed guitar, and here's why. This is a 3D printed guitar made by a complete novice, one who does not have access to the precision equipment required to make a guitar to today's standards. For most people making this, it is unlikely to match the level of craftsmanship of most bass guitars. As well, this is a really unique, totally out-of-the-box instrument design that utilizes very niche materials for a guitar. But with that being said, there are some very nice features of this bass, and it does sound and play surprisingly well for what it is. So, some technical specs on this thing first. It's a short scale bass. Most bass guitars are long scale bass, but this neck is just a little longer than a traditional 6-string guitar neck. Now, don't let that fool you because this is capable of producing nice deep bass. It utilizes P-bass pickups and includes no preamp. And aside from the nut and maybe the bridge, everything else on this is standard run-of-the-mill bass guts. So, what's so cool about this thing? Well, there's quite a few things. Design, for one, I just think it looks really cool. Outside of maybe a U bass, it's the lightest bass guitar you'll ever pick up, and it's super compact. It also allows you to play the strings through the body, which is kind of weird, but most importantly, it plays notes. You intonate the guitar simply by sliding the bridge up and down the extrusion, and the bridge is locked in place with a screw at the bottom of it. The pickups, while cheap, sound good enough for what they are. Plugged in, it sounds and mostly plays like any other bass guitar. The neck, while chunkier than your traditional bass guitar neck, is usable. And lastly, one of the features I appreciate the most is the action of the strings feel very consistent along the entire length of the neck. It's one of the aspects of this instrument that I think trumps your standard lower end pre-made bass guitar. Also, find another guitar that if you break something, you can just make the piece again. But enough with the gushing. This bass is my creation, and I adore it simply because of that. But rose tinted glasses off, there is one glaring issue with this bass, and I can't help but feel will turn off a lot of bass players to this instrument due to this issue alone, and that is the way that the pickups are mounted. The issue is that they sit right in the middle of where you're supposed to play. There are ways to play it, but it does very much get in the way and alter your playing style. The biggest issue I've had so far is that I cannot figure out a reliable way to palm mute. My hand just does not have enough room. The pickups take up a pretty comical amount of picking, slapping, plucking real estate. Secondly, tuning stability is weird. I've seen better, I've seen worse, but more often than not, it's flat when I go to play it. The real issue is that while the extrusion keeps the instrument stiff, there is still some play when you torque on the neck or body, so tuning can fluctuate if you manhandle it a bit. Another issue is that there is no truss rod, so the action and neck profile that you get is what you get. Build materials are also questionable. It's held steady for 3 months as of making this, but I cannot yet say how long this bass will hold up. Getting to the minor gripes, one thing that bothers me is the way the strings stick out from under the body. One day I plan on modifying that part to recess them into the body. And also the straps are kind of weird. They slot into the extrusion and you can slide them up and down to adjust, but I just haven't found a position that's comfortable yet. So that's my quick overview of this guitar, and hopefully that kind of helps give you an idea on whether or not this is a project that you want to take on. Now I will play some raw audio as well as a little build montage. But thanks for watching.